Maestro Semyon Bychkov. Seien Sie willkommen im Digital Concert Hall der Philharmoniker. Sie sind in Leningrad geboren, was heutzutage St. Petersburg heißt, und aber mussten ziemlich früh ihre Heimat verlassen, ich glaube mit 22. Bleibt trotzdem für Sie die russische Musik, also die russischen Komponisten, ihre Heimat?
Naturally. Since you're born in a country, automatically you're the child of the country, of its culture, of its language. So naturally Russian music is something that was important to me always. But as it is, I think, with every musician, not all music that is composed in Russia is particularly part of my life. It is just the greatest of it that really interests me. And so, of course, I think of Tchaikovsky, and I think of Glinka and Rachmaninoff, and naturally of Shostakovich. Otherwise, I don't know why, but my sensibility was always, the gravitation was always towards German music and the Italian music. And so it is, in a way, I think also the way my identity has become since I left Russia, because in all the intervening years, and now we are going from 1975, when I left the Soviet Union, to 2013, the years of life in America, the years of life in France, the years of life and making music in Germany and Italy and England and other countries. And so, in a way, the musician's identity corresponds to the identity of the person. And so, even though the Russian language and the Russian culture are very much part of me and always will be, it is today mixed with others, which is what I particularly find interesting and important. And so, yes, it was 22 years when I left Russia. I was young, but not so young. I had the time to assimilate the Russian identity, cultural roots, and also, I would say, an outlook on life that was given to me by people who influenced me so much in the beginning.
Ah ja. Dann habe ich eine andere Frage. Haben Sie eine ganz besondere Affinität zu Schostakowitsch? Also ich kann mich erinnern, als Sie das erste Mal zu uns kamen, haben Sie Schostakowitsch Sinfonie Nummer 5 dirigiert. Das war ein fulminanter Erfolg, also es war wirklich großartig. Und heute Abend dirigieren Sie die 11. von Schostakowitsch auch wieder, und die wir, glaube ich, 87 aufgenommen haben. Also dazu habe ich zwei Fragen. Erstmal ein bisschen Ihre Affinität zu Schostakowitsch, dann ein bisschen, wenn Sie uns ein bisschen über die Inhalte von dieser 11. Sinfonie erzählen könnten, was Sie großartig in den Proben gemacht haben, sodass das Publikum auch ein bisschen teilhaben könnte. Und dann wollte ich Sie eine andere Frage, welcher große Unterschied zwischen 2014 und 1987 im Orchester stellen Sie fest? Also das Orchester hat sich quasi erneuert seit der Zeit.
Wow, what a huge question. My affinity to Shostakovich, it's colossal, because he was a spokesman for his people. You know, there are spokesmen for our presidents, there are spokesmen for politicians, and there is an artist who speaks for his nation, for the destiny of his people. It will be a composer, it will be a writer, it will be a painter, it doesn't matter, but it will be life that becomes art, from which art is born, that is so connected to life that it becomes one and the same. And this is the power of Shostakovich music, how he found the way to express through sounds what his people lived at the time when he lived it. Of course, I lived it too, not the worst part of it. I did not live 1930s when people were disappearing in millions, never to be heard from again. I lived in, well, 50s, of course, I was still a child, but I lived the 1960s and early 70s, which was less severe, but nevertheless quite restrictive. And so here Shostakovich had to find a way in which he would express what people were living, what they were feeling, what they were thinking, but to do it in a way that would be allowed, so that everyone will understand it the way that they wanted to understand it, which means the authorities would explain his music in a way that was advantageous to the ideology, whereas the people, once they heard those sounds, they identified with them because they immediately understood what was behind the notes, as the musicians like to say. And so in that sense, of course, me being also a child of the same country, and genetically my family, my parents were in fact as a generation younger than Shostakovich, but nevertheless they did live through the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s and so on. And so in a way we are genetically pre-programmed. And so after that, of course, it's a matter of taste, and there are people in my generation who do not feel the same affinity to music of Shostakovich. That is very individual. But there is no denial that in 20th century, for my opinion, Shostakovich comes closest to Beethoven. Both were afflicted. One was afflicted physically, and the other one was afflicted mentally and emotionally. Both were strong enough to conquer the affliction and to compose something that make all of us identify with it. And maybe because of this identification, when I left the Soviet Union, for the first several years, I absolutely could not stand listening to the sounds of Shostakovich music, because it brought me so much closer to what I left behind that it was too painful and I could not accept it. Of course, once enough time had passed, the love of his music came back, and even stronger than ever before. And so it was actually for that reason that when I came here for the first time to conduct this orchestra in 1985, on a very short notice, replacing Riccardo Muti, who had to cancel. And I was asked to do that 3 days before the beginning of rehearsals. We had to choose the program. It was a Prokofiev Concerto No. 3 with Alexis Weisenberg. And the second half was open to me. Riccardo was supposed to conduct Manfred of Tchaikovsky, which was not in my repertoire. And so I said, no, I would like to bring Shostakovich Symphony No. 5, which was my first love in the music of Shostakovich as a child. And so it was accepted, and we know the rest. And then several years later, 2 years later, came Symphony No. 11. And there, of course, it is also a rather personal experience for me, because it describes events that happened in Russia in 1905. On the 9th of January 1905, which became known in history as Bloody Sunday. There was a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration, of very poor workers who were led by a priest who marched through the city of St. Petersburg, then capital of Russia. They believed that the Tsar would receive them, and they could present him with a petition asking him to improve their living conditions. And they marched through the city. One of those people marching wrote a letter the night before to his wife, who lived in the countryside with their children. He could barely write. I have read his letter, in which he said that tomorrow we will present the petition to Tsar Father, as they called him. And if anything goes wrong, I would like you to tell the children how much I love them and you, and bring them up really well in life. The men could barely write. When they marched, they dressed the best clothes they had. It was Sunday. And so when they came to the Palace Square, which is the Winter Palace, was where the Tsar lived. Today it is Hermitage Museum. When they came to the square, most magnificent, most beautiful, very vast space, they were met by the fire from the palace guards. The Tsar was not even there. He was in his country estate. And so they were massacred. And that provoked the spontaneous uprising in other cities in Russia, which became known as the First Russian Revolution of the 20th century. That is 1905. And then it was suppressed, and then it was relatively quiet until World War I had begun. For Russia, it started in 1914. And it was that led to the eventual destruction of the monarchy in Russia. In 1917, the communists took power. And so that was the second revolution of 1917. So Shostakovich has written symphony that is dedicated to the victims of the revolution of 1905. And so the first movement is this kind of a frozen atmosphere of the winter in St. Petersburg and that Palace Square. And it is very quiet, and we hear some melodies that are often quotes of folk songs that were sung by people often in the prisons, in camps, because they existed in Russia always. And those Russians who hear these melodies, they automatically identify with the songs. They know what it is about. And the second movement is, it is this 9th of January, so it in fact consists of two parts. The first part is this movement of people, very peaceful, becomes very dramatic, but nevertheless it is based on the musical material that one can identify with pleading, mercy. And then it is replaced by the second part, where it is really a theme of aggression, of the assault. It is a massacre, essentially. And it ends with a tremendous crash, and suddenly there is nothing, it's quiet. And you literally see that enormous space, and that is what makes you think, how can man be so cruel? Where on one hand you see the most unbelievable architecture that makes that Palace Square. On the other hand, you see the sign of total devastation. And this is the contrast, and in a way, a contradiction of human nature, which is capable of both the most extraordinary beauty and the most amazing cruelty. And so after that we hear the third movement, which is a requiem to the victims. Shostakovich always wrote a requiem. In every piece of his there is always a requiem, because there is always reason to mourn the victims. And then comes the last moment, and that one is the enigma. Because in a way, according to the title, it basically means that it's the announcement of the future that will come. It's very interesting. When the symphony was composed in 1956, it received immediate approval from the government. They were very happy to announce that, of course, the future after 1905 was going to be very glorious. And here, the clever Shostakovich, what did he do at the very end of the symphony? We hear the three notes played by the bells in the very last bars. And the three notes are alternating between a major interval, a major third, and a minor interval, a minor third. And so they alternate several times, major, minor, major, minor. And the way we identify with tonality is also the mood that it represents. So in a most primitive way, a major key will represent happiness, and a minor key will represent sadness or tragedy. It is never quite so simple the way I describe it, but in the most sort of a banal way in which we identify with the intervals, it is so. So why is it the symphony ends with a minor interval and not a major one? And there lies the key to the understanding of the piece. It is, of course, a victory, but of what? It's the victory of evil. It's a victory of tragedy. The revolution of 1917 resulted in a century of violence, death, destruction, dictatorship, all kinds of things that we find unacceptable in the democratic society. Is that a purely Russian phenomena? No. In 1956, when this symphony was composed, That was the year of the Hungarian uprising that was suppressed by the Soviet tanks. And how much of that happens, exactly the same things happens all over the world today, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and unfortunately, I'm afraid, as long as we remain the way we are as humans, without controlling our worst instincts, there is always the risk that it will happen again. And so that makes him truly universal.
Thank you very much. And now my last question: how did
was
the orchestra change
in 1987?
Yes.
Well, I tell you, it is for me, in a way, very amusing and very touching to see that. It has to do with my own life. At the time when I conducted this orchestra for the first time in 1985, or when I recorded and conducted the Symphony No. 11 2 years later, I was younger than most of the artists on this stage. Today, when I come here, I'm older than most of the artists on this stage. And so clearly you see that, yes, the name Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra is exactly as it was. It will always be the same. Is it the same orchestra? In some ways, but in some ways it's very different because it's a different generation. It's also an orchestra that is today very international. At the time when I started to make music here, and you know it very well, you come from Switzerland, you were in a way, artists like you were in minority. First of all, you were the first lady in this orchestra, which became big news, enormous. It was a revolution, a beautiful revolution too. But were you accepted into this orchestra because you're a lady? No. It's because you deserved it as an artist. And the fact that you're a lady, it was just a fact of life. Wonderful, great. Today, I see many ladies in this orchestra. I see that it is no longer a German orchestra with few foreigners. I would say it's an orchestra of lots of foreigners with many Germans. So, but in a way, it is much more international. So it brings advantages, it also brings a challenge, because this generation has a responsibility to those who preceded them. The responsibility of continuing the glorious tradition. It does not mean that it must remain exactly the same way in the way in which it makes music. No, it must develop. We all know this. But the attitude towards music as something infinitely greater than any one of us, that attitude had made this orchestra glorious. This is the attitude that must remain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.